Welcome back to Myths and Mischief. I'm Cray, and today we're going to take a little walk to the streets of Whitechapel, London, to a certain serial killer's stomping grounds. Please be aware that viewer discretion is advised, as we will be going over topics of murder and adultery. Years ago, on the dark streets of Whitechapel, London, something peculiar lurked in the shadows. No one knew when it would strike, but when it did, it sent your plans floating down a river. Join us today as we talk about the notorious one and only Jack the Ripper. So let's start with the obvious. Who was Jack? Jack was the name given to a notorious serial killer who roamed the streets of London, Whitechapel in the late 1800s and is well known for mutilating his victims. But is there more to this story than what history tells us? The 5 known victims of the Ripper's rage were Mary Ann Nichols, found August 31st, 1888, Annie Chapman, found September the 8th, 1888, Elizabeth Stride, found September the 30th, 1888, Catherine Eddowes, also found September the 30th, 1888, and Mary Jane Kelly, found November 9th, 1888. All the victims that were discovered were well known as working women, and, without fail, all of their corpses had been mutilated beyond repair. But was there more to the story, perchance? According to history, Mary Ann Nichols is believed to be the first Jack the Ripper victim, with her being discovered in August, followed by the rest and ending with Mary Jane Kelly. However, with the identity of the assailant still unknown to this day, having never been caught, there is the potential that Jack could have moved on from Whitechapel, instead choosing to kill elsewhere. With this in mind, we need to consider something that the police at the time didn't. Was Mary Ann Nichols really the last victim after all? Although she is not one of the 5 famous victims, Martha Tabram was considered to be connected to Jack the Ripper murders due to the sheer nature of her murder. Found on the 7th of August 1888 in George Yard, Martha Tabram had 39 separate stab wounds inflicted with multiple different weapons. The treatment of this victim matched those of Jack the Ripper's signature style, as well as her position as a prostitute of Whitechapel. However, a later discovery in the mid-20th century resulted in a general consensus that she was unlikely to be the first Jack the Ripper victim. If we're talking about potential murder victims, then of course we have to have an honourable mention for Emma Smith, who was said to be the earliest recorded victim in the Whitechapel murder files, having died on the 4th of April 1888 in London Hospital. She lived out her life on George Street and was generally known to be a prostitute, though there was much mystery surrounding her life, most of which is now unfortunately lost by history. Her death was said to have been caused by a brutal attack on the evening of Easter Monday on the 2nd of April, finally succumbing to peritonitis and rupturing of the tissue inside her abdomen, and eventually kicking off the Whitechapel murders that spanned from 1888 to 1891. So what did these victims have in common? There are many different views and opinions on whether these women were actually working women, involved with the notorious Jack, or simply just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Police at the time believed that the connections between them varied, from being lured out for an adulterous adventure, or being killed in their sleep. However, after the coroner's inquest determined there had been no sign of a struggle, they went with the first option, therefore marking the victims down into history as working women, a typical conclusion of this period of time. There is also of course the fact that they were all women who were out in the streets of Whitechapel late at night, so maybe Jack just targeted those who were out in the early hours. It does however make you wonder if any of these murders were witnessed by the candlelighters tending to the streetlights. There have been many attempts over the years to reopen the murder files of Jack the Ripper in a desperate attempt to finally solve the mystery, but no matter the time, there have been multiple roadblocks. Why, may you ask? Well, let's dive in. Firstly, the evidence. Suspects in the Jack the Ripper case include several different people, none of which have been directly discovered to actually have been Jack, but let's have a look at a couple of the candidates. It's unlikely that many people have heard of Carl Feigenbaum. It was reported that he changed his name several times, meaning that we may never know his true identity. What we do know is that he was born in Germany around 1840 and died in New York's Sing Sing prison in 1894. Carl was eventually killed via electric chair after being discovered standing over the body of Miss Juliana Hoffman in 1894, who was his landlady, brandishing a large carving knife. Similar to Jack the Ripper, Carl reportedly had a desire to mutilate women. He knew most of the human anatomy, and after his death, his lawyer gave an interview saying that he believed his former client to be Jack the Ripper, although it's impossible to say whether this was truth or simply for publicity. Just like the murder of the 5 Ripper victims, Mrs. Hoffman was attacked with a knife, being filleted and stabbed with a knife while her son watched from the window. The incident was reported as a supposed robbery. Another reason why Carl is in the suspect list for candidates to be Jack the Ripper includes his relationship with Catherine Eddowes, who was killed not far from St. Catherine's and the London docks, close to a boat called the Raya, which Carl was rumoured to have worked on. There are a few similarities between Carl and Jack's style, including the weapon choice and the brutality of the murders. However, that's just about it. There are rumours that even though his residence and place of work were relatively close to the 5 murder victims, he was nowhere near Whitechapel during Jack's killing spree, eventually arriving in America in 1890. This does, however, link him to the theory that Jack travelled around to avoid capture after his murder sprees. And now we move on to lucky number 2, Joseph Barnett. Joseph Barnett was said to be the boyfriend of Jack the Ripper victim Mary Jane Kelly. He is the only suspect known to have a direct link with one of the victims, and therefore he makes the suspect list at number 2. Joseph was born on the 25th of May 1858 in Whitechapel, his parents having said to have migrated from Ireland, and his father going on to become a licensed fish porter at Billingsgate Market. By 1871, Joseph Barnett followed his father's footsteps and gained his fish porter license as well, therefore securing residence right in the heart of what later became known as Jack the Ripper's stomping ground. On the night that Barnett and Kelly met, they drank together, eventually becoming closer over the course of the evening and subsequently agreeing to meet again the following day, and then eventually becoming a couple and acquiring lodgings on George Street. Over time, their home address was said to have changed due to shortcomings on rent and general drunkenness and violent behaviour. From a first look, it might seem as though they moved together rather rapidly, especially when you consider the time era, and it's unknown how Kelly earned money at the time. But if her past career was accurate according to history, then there is little doubt that Barnett had probably paid for his first encounter with the woman and repeated the process the next day. Perhaps he took a shine to her and promised to take her away from her horrible life. In his own way, he probably felt as though he was saving her from the streets, but little did he know what that night would lead to. Eventually, Joseph Barnett lost his fish porter license. The circumstances behind this are unknown, and there has been much speculation as to the reasons, namely thefts, drunkenness, or simply being laid off. Either way, money stopped entering the home, and soon after, the relationship deteriorated, with the couple arguing and becoming violent towards each other at an increasing frequency. At some point, Mary decided it was time to go back to prostitution, likely as a response to Barnett losing his job, as this would have undoubtedly led them to being back out on the streets had she not taken up the mantle. According to some witness reports, Barnett would never allow Kelly to go back to a life of prostitution, suggesting that this was probably the main cause of their arguments. Kelly was different from the other victims of Jack the Ripper. as she was the only prostitute with her own accommodation and a place where she could potentially bring clients off of the street. This suggests that during late July and early August 1888, Joseph Barnett was effectively being kicked out to the streets during the time Kelly would be working. This also coincides with the start of the Jack the Ripper murders. Maybe Barnett took up the mantle as Jack the Ripper to simply pass the time. The night before Kelly died, Joseph Barnett went to visit her in her room at Miller's Court. We don't know what was said, but many believe that Barnett may have been pleading with her to take him back. Approximately 11 hours later, a man called John McCarthy sent a man named Thomas Bauer to collect the huge amount of rent owed by Kelly, but upon knocking on the door and receiving no reply, Bauer decided to go around and look through the windows, discovering the brutally mutilated body of Mary Kelly. Was Mary Kelly murdered by Jack the Ripper? Or was she murdered by Joseph Barnett? Perhaps both men are simply one and the same. Or Jack was just a client. Barnett's life after the Kelly murder remains a mystery until 1906, when he was given a new porter's license at Billingsgate. Not much else is known, but he is recorded as dying on the 29th of November 1926, aged 68. The cause of death was reported as bronchitis and edema of the lungs. Now, if we are talking Jack the Ripper suspects, we have to have an honourable mention for Seweryn Kalowski. Seweryn Kalowski, perhaps better known as George Chapman, was a convicted Polish serial killer who was also named as one of the infamous Jack the Ripper suspects. Despite being a suspect, it was reported that he had no ties with the victims, so why was he named a suspect? There is little to note about his early years. However, it is thought that he was an apprentice to a senior surgeon in Zwolle from the age of 14. Looking at history, it is thought that he moved to London between 1887 and 1888, settling into the East End of London shortly before Jack the Ripper came into motion. Kalowski worked in a hairdresser's, eventually opening up a barbershop of his own and getting married with 2 children. The family moved around London a lot before moving over to Jersey in 1891. However, it wasn't long before his wife returned to London, less than a year in fact, after Kalowski became violent and abusive to her while she became pregnant. It didn't take long for Kalowski to return to London himself, eventually reuniting with his wife for a short time. However, by 1893 things had definitely ended between the pair, and he began a relationship with a woman he met at work, taking her surname and becoming known as George Chapman. The first piece of evidence to suggest that he was a viable Jack the Ripper suspect is attributed to his arrival in London's East End shortly before the murders started. His proximity to the location of the first Ripper killings, also the convenient timing for the series of murders coming to the end as he left the country and moved to the United States. Could this be a link between him and the Ripper? Or merely just a coincidence? Throughout his 20s, he was said to have become increasingly more violent, and it's believed that after an almost fatal attack on his wife in 1891, is what led his wife to flee her husband in the first place. It is suspected that he held her down and was strangling her when they were interrupted by a customer coming into a shop next to their room. His history of being a surgeon's apprentice would have also come in handy for learning anatomical builds of the human body, of which Jack the Ripper was said to have proficient knowledge in. In addition to this, Kalowski matched a witness description of a man seen with Mary Jane Kelly, another of Jack the Ripper's victims. Despite moving around a lot to avoid suspicion over the multiple deaths linked to his poisonings, that's a story for another time, the police only began their investigation of Chapman following the death of Marsh in 1902. After the bodies of his first 2 poisonings were exhumed by the police, he was charged and convicted on the 19th of March 1903 and sentenced to death by hanging on the 7th of April 1903. Jack was also known to have sent in multiple letters to the police from various locations in London. So could this tie in with Klawski's constant relocation? Maybe he wanted to make it harder for the police to track his whereabouts. So what do you think? Will Jack ever be discovered? Or is he simply a shadow on the wind, swept away by time? Let us know what you think down in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you liked this video, and we will see you next time on Myths and Mischief.